Good evening. Tonight we step into one of medicine's darkest chapters, a story that begins not in back alleys or criminal enterprises, but in the pristine laboratories of one of the world's most respected pharmaceutical companies. This is not a tale of street dealers or desperate addicts, at least not at first. This is a story of brilliant scientists, of corporate ambition, of a drug that was hailed as a miracle and marketed as safe for children. A drug that promised to cure addiction itself, only to create an epidemic that would claim millions of lives and continues to devastate communities to this very day. Forget the Hollywood versions of strung-out artists and desperate street corners. The truth is far more disturbing because it begins with trust, with white coats and medical degrees, with advertising campaigns and doctors' recommendations. This is the story of how a pharmaceutical company convinced the world that they had created a wonder drug, how they marketed it aggressively for over a decade, and how by the time the terrible truth became undeniable, it was far too late. Millions were already addicted, and the genie could never be put back in the bottle. Before you settle in for this long journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find value in these explorations of history's most consequential mistakes. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see this global community come together to learn from the past. Now, dim the lights, silence your notifications, find a comfortable position, and let's begin this tragic story of heroin, the drug that was supposed to save the world from morphine addiction. Before there was heroin, before there was morphine, before there was even a name for the alkaloids that would change human history, there was simply the flower. The story must begin here, as all stories of opioids must, with Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy. Stand for a moment in an ancient field, perhaps in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, and look at this plant. It stands perhaps 3 feet high, its stem a pale waxy green that appears almost blue in the haze of a summer afternoon. At its top sits the flower, a delicate cup of petals as thin as parchment, fluttering in the slightest breeze. The petals might be white, or a soft blushing pink, or a deep bruised purple that seems to hold the color of twilight. They are beautiful, ephemeral, lasting only a few days before they fall away. But the petals are not the prize, never were. After they fall, they leave behind something far more significant, the pod, a small crowned globe, a seed head that swells with the promise of new life, and something far more profound. Inside this globe, hidden within its green walls, runs a network of fine vessels carrying a milky white latex, a bitter sap that has been humanity's most intimate and dangerous relationship with a plant for thousands of years. This is where the story begins, in this sap, in the soft fertile earth between 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. In the long, slow dawn of civilization, the Sumerians, those remarkable people who gave the world writing and the wheel, cultivated vast fields of these nodding flowers. They knew the secret of the pod, knowledge passed down from generation to generation, from healer to apprentice. The technique was simple but required precision and timing. When the petals had fallen, and the pod had swollen but not yet fully ripened, when the latex inside was at its most potent, they would take a small sharp knife, often made of flint or bronze, and make a series of shallow, careful incisions in the pod's skin. The cuts had to be deep enough to penetrate the latex vessels, but not so deep as to pierce the seed chamber inside. Almost immediately, the white milk would begin to weep from these wounds, beading on the surface like tears. This was the crucial moment. Left exposed to the air and sun, this milky substance would slowly oxidize over several hours, thickening and darkening, transforming from white to tan to a sticky brownish-black gum. This was opium in its raw form, unrefined, unpredictable, but undeniably powerful. The Sumerians would scrape this gum from the pods with careful reverence, roll it into balls or press it into cakes, and store it away like treasure. They had a name for this plant, a name preserved on clay cuneiform tablets dating back over 4,000 years, a name that tells you everything you need to know about their relationship with it. Whole gill, the joy plant. The Sumerians pressed opium into tablets, and prescribed it for all manner of ailments. For the intractable coughs that plagued agricultural communities living in dusty conditions, for the deep gut-wrenching pains of dysentery that killed more people in the ancient world than any war, for the fever and delirium of infections they could not understand or treat. But opium's greatest gift was not the relief of physical symptoms. Its greatest gift was oblivion, a gentle, painless slide into sleep, a temporary escape from the troubles of a harsh and unforgiving world where life was short, brutal, and filled with suffering. In a time before modern medicine, before antibiotics, or surgery, or even basic sanitation, when childhood mortality was over 50% and the average lifespan barely reached 30 years, when injuries that we would consider minor were often fatal, and chronic pain was an inescapable companion for most adults, opium was not a luxury, it was a necessity. It was perhaps the only truly effective medicine humanity possessed, the only reliable way to ease suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. The knowledge of the joy plant was precious, treated as a piece of divine technology passed down from healer to healer, from priest-physician to apprentice, carefully guarded and reverently administered. From Mesopotamia, opium began its long journey across the ancient world. It moved with the caravans, those long trains of camels and donkeys that connected the great civilizations of antiquity, carrying goods and ideas across vast distances. A small dark brick of opium, wrapped carefully in cloth or leather, would be tucked into saddlebags alongside more conventional trade goods: copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon, textiles from Assyria, spices from the East. Opium was valuable, compact, and highly sought after, making it an ideal trade commodity. It made its way along the ancient trade routes to the great empires of the Nile. In Egypt, the poppy found not just users but true believers. Egyptian physicians, who were also priests in a culture where medicine and religion were inseparable, administered opium with a reverence usually reserved for the gods themselves. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most comprehensive medical texts in existence, dating back to approximately 1550 BCE during Egypt's New Kingdom, contains hundreds of prescriptions and remedies. Among them are multiple references to opium, recommended for a wide range of conditions. It was prescribed to stop the excessive crying of children, a practice that seems horrifying in retrospect, but was common in a world where a crying infant might mean sleepless nights for an entire family living in a single room. It was used to treat eye diseases, still one of the most common afflictions in the dusty Nile Valley. It was administered to women suffering difficult childbirth, and it was incorporated into elaborate religious rituals, used by priests seeking visions or attempting to communicate with the divine, a key to unlock the doorways between the mortal and immortal realms. The Egyptians took their relationship with opium so seriously that the poppy became part of their funerary practices. Archaeological excavations of royal tombs have found containers of opium among grave goods, placed alongside food, jewelry, and other items deemed necessary for the journey through the afterlife. The deceased would need sustenance in the next world, the Egyptians reasoned, and what better comfort for that long journey than the joy plant, the substance that had eased their suffering in life. This was not recreational use or addiction in any modern sense. This was a culture that had woven opium so thoroughly into its medical, religious, and social fabric that life without it was unimaginable. The city of Thebes became particularly famous for opium cultivation and production, with fields of poppies tended by specialized farmers. Theban opium was considered among the finest in the ancient world, carefully harvested, processed and sealed in clay amphorae for export. These amphorae, marked with the seal of Thebes to guarantee quality and origin, became a common sight in ports throughout the Mediterranean world, carried by the greatest merchants and sailors of antiquity, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, those remarkable seafaring people who established trading colonies from their homeland in modern Lebanon, all the way to Spain, and even beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, were the Amazon delivery service of the ancient world. Their ships, sturdy and seaworthy, with distinctive curved prows and square sails, carried goods of every description across the Mediterranean and beyond. Among their most valuable cargoes was Egyptian opium, packed carefully in those sealed amphorae, destined for markets throughout the known world. They took it to Carthage, their greatest colony in North Africa. They brought it to Spain, where they established mines and trading posts. They carried it to the islands of the Mediterranean, to Crete and Cyprus, to Sicily and Sardinia, and most importantly for our story, they brought it to Greece, to the culture that would become the foundation of Western civilization. Here in the city-states of ancient Greece, opium was not just a medicine, it became woven into the very fabric of mythology, philosophy and culture in ways that would influence Western thought for millennia. The Greeks, with their genius for systematic thinking, and their love of categorization, did not simply use opium. They tried to understand it, to place it within their complex worldview of gods and natural philosophy. The ancient Greeks associated the poppy with several deities, revealing their sophisticated understanding of the drug's nature. Hypnos, the god of sleep, was often depicted holding poppies or a container of opium, recognizing the substance's power to induce slumber. His son Morpheus, the god of dreams who could take human form and appear in the dreams of mortals, lent his name to the principal alkaloid that would eventually be extracted from opium over 2,000 years later. But most tellingly, the Greeks also associated poppies with Thanatos, the god of death, the twin brother of Hypnos. This was not superstition or primitive thinking. This was an accurate recognition of opium's fundamental duality, its razor's edge between healing and harm. The substance could bring gentle, peaceful sleep, relief from suffering, a blessed rest for the weary and pained. But too much, just a little too much, could bring a sleep from which one never woke, a descent into unconsciousness, and then death as breathing slowed and finally stopped. The Greeks understood that the line between medicine and poison, between therapy and toxicity, was thin and easily crossed. This understanding, this healthy respect for opium's power, would be one of the most valuable pieces of knowledge they passed down to future generations. Though it would often be forgotten or ignored by doctors and pharmaceutical companies confident in their ability to control nature's most powerful medicines. Hippocrates of Kos, the father of Western medicine, who lived in the 5th century BCE, and whose oath is still sworn by physicians today, approached opium with a clinician's pragmatic eye. He had no patience for the magical thinking that surrounded much of ancient medicine, the elaborate rituals and appeals to gods that characterized healing practices in many cultures. Hippocrates insisted that disease had natural causes and natural treatments, that the physician's role was to understand the body and work with its natural healing processes. He systematically catalogued the effects of various medicines, including opium, based on careful observation rather than tradition or superstition. He praised opium's utility as a painkiller, noting its effectiveness for injuries, chronic conditions, and the severe pain of terminal illness. He recommended it as a styptic, an agent to stop bleeding, based on observations that opium seemed to slow various bodily processes. He documented its use for treating internal ailments, dysentery and women's conditions. But he also warned of the dangers of excessive use, noting that large doses could lead to stupor and death. Hippocrates codified the medical use of opium, lending it an air of scientific respectability that would last for centuries. His writings, compiled in the Hippocratic corpus and studied by physicians for the next 2,000 years, established opium as a legitimate and essential medicine, the physician's most powerful weapon against suffering. By the time the Roman Empire rose to dominate the known world, spanning from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, opium was perhaps the most widely used and effective drug in the physician's arsenal. The city of Rome itself, with a population approaching 1 million people, was a massive consumer of opium and opium preparations. The substance was everywhere, used by all classes of society. Roman soldiers, the legendary legions that conquered and held this vast empire, marched with opium in their medical supplies. Army surgeons used it to treat battlefield wounds, to ease the agony of soldiers waiting for treatment, to allow men to survive injuries that would otherwise kill through shock and pain. In the teeming city of Rome, street vendors sold opium preparations alongside bread and wine, hawking their wares to anyone with a few coins. The wealthy consumed it in elaborate preparations, while the poor bought cheaper, cruder versions. Slaves were given it to make brutal labor more endurable. Gladiators took it before entering the arena. Mothers gave it to teething infants. It was simply part of life, as common and unremarkable as salt or olive oil. The most famous physician of the Roman era, indeed one of the most influential medical thinkers in all of history, was Galen of Pergamon. Born in 129 CE in the Greek city of Pergamon, now in modern Turkey, Galen came to Rome and became physician to multiple emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who was himself a regular opium user. Galen was a true believer in opium's powers, describing it in terms that bordered on the miraculous. He saw it as a near panacea, a cure for an astonishing range of conditions. In his voluminous medical writings, which would dominate European medicine until the Renaissance 1500 years later, Galen recommended opium for headaches of all kinds, from mild to severe to the crushing migraines that left sufferers bedridden. He prescribed it for epilepsy, that mysterious condition of seizures that ancient medicine could not understand or effectively treat. He used it for snake bites and poisonous stings, believing it counteracted venom. He administered it for melancholy, what we might today call depression, noting that it lifted the spirits and brought contentment. He gave it for vertigo, for deafness, for loss of voice, for dimness of vision, for asthma and chronic cough. The list went on, encompassing nearly every ailment known to Roman medicine. Galen's most famous use of opium was in his legendary theriac, sometimes called Mithridatium, after the ancient king who supposedly invented it. This was a fantastically complex preparation, a pharmaceutical monument to Roman medicine's ambition. The recipe called for dozens of ingredients, sometimes over 60 different substances, each carefully measured and combined in a specific order following an elaborate process that took months to complete. The ingredients included exotic spices from the far reaches of the empire and beyond, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, frankincense from Arabia. There were animal products, viper flesh, that had to be prepared in a specific ritual manner, supposedly to counteract poisons. There were numerous herbs and minerals, each contributing some supposed benefit to the mixture, but the essential ingredient, the one that made theriac effective and not merely an expensive placebo, was opium. A substantial quantity of opium formed the base of every theriac recipe, providing the real therapeutic effects, while the other ingredients added flavor, mystique, and justification for the astronomical price. Theriac was outrageously expensive, affordable only to the wealthy, and it became a status symbol as much as a medicine. To be able to afford theriac, to take it regularly as a preventative and health tonic, was a mark of sophistication and means. Galen's writings about theriac and opium's benefits would be preserved, copied, translated and studied for the next 15 centuries, establishing opium's reputation as medicine's most valuable tool with an authority that would prove nearly impossible to question. Part 1 continues, but approximately 15,000 characters, so far, continuing to 20,000. For centuries after the fall of Rome, through the chaos of the Dark Ages, and into the medieval period, this remained the state of affairs. Opium, in its raw form as dark brownish gum, was a constant presence in medicine, a reliable friend in a world filled with pain and suffering. Its power was undeniable, recognized by every medical tradition from Europe to China, from Islamic medicine to Ayurvedic practice in India. But it was also unpredictable, variable, sometimes dangerously so. The potency of one batch of opium could vary wildly from the next, depending on countless factors: the soil where the poppies grew, the weather during the growing season, the exact timing of the harvest, how the latex was collected and processed, how long it had been stored and under what conditions. A dose that brought blessed relief one day might be far too weak the next, leaving the patient in agony. Or worse, a dose from a particularly potent batch might be fatal, sending the patient into a stupor from which they never awoke, their breathing growing slower and slower, until it simply stopped. Physicians had rules of thumb, guidelines based on experience, but no reliable way to ensure consistency. They often told patients to start with a small amount, and gradually increase until they found relief, hoping they would stop before reaching a toxic dose. Opium was a powerful but blunt instrument, and its use was as much art as science, requiring judgment, experience, and not a little bit of luck. Medicine in this era was still largely based on ancient authorities, on the texts of Galen and Hippocrates and Avicenna, copied and recopied by hand, translated and retranslated from Greek to Arabic to Latin, sometimes suffering corruption and error in the process. Physicians memorized these texts, learned the traditional preparations and prescriptions, and followed the practices that had been handed down for centuries. Innovation was rare, experimentation discouraged. The great medical schools of Europe, at universities like Bologna and Paris and Montpellier, taught students to revere the ancients and follow their teachings. To question Galen was considered not just wrong but dangerous, potentially heretical. But the world was changing, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The Renaissance, beginning in Italy in the 14th century and spreading across Europe over the next 2 centuries, brought a new spirit of inquiry, a willingness to question ancient authorities and seek knowledge through direct observation and experiment. The Protestant Reformation shattered the Catholic Church's intellectual monopoly in Northern Europe, creating space for new ideas. The Age of Exploration brought Europeans into contact with civilizations and knowledge systems they had never imagined, forcing them to recognize that the ancients had not known everything. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg around 1440, allowed knowledge to spread faster than ever before, making books affordable and accessible to a much broader audience. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, with figures like Galileo, Newton and Harvey, demonstrated that nature could be understood through systematic observation and mathematical analysis, that the universe operated according to discoverable laws rather than divine whim or ancient authority. By the late 18th century, this spirit of scientific inquiry was transforming every field of human knowledge, and chemistry was experiencing a particularly dramatic revolution. The old art of alchemy, with its mystical goals of transmuting base metals into gold and discovering the elixir of life, was giving way to modern chemistry, based on careful measurement, systematic experiment, and reproducible results. Chemists were beginning to understand that matter was composed of fundamental elements that could combine in specific proportions to form compounds, but these compounds had fixed properties that could be studied and predicted. They were developing new techniques for isolating and purifying substances, for determining their composition, for synthesizing new compounds that had never existed in nature. One of their most ambitious goals was to take the complex mixtures that had been used as medicines for centuries, crude preparations of plants and minerals, and break them down to find the active ingredients, the specific substances responsible for therapeutic effects. If they could isolate these active principles in pure form, they reasoned, they could create medicines of known and consistent strength that could be measured precisely and administered reliably. No longer would doctors have to guess at potency or hope that their opium was not too weak or too strong. They would have pure chemicals of standard strength, the same in every batch, enabling scientific medicine based on precise dosing. In this environment of chemical revolution and pharmaceutical ambition, in the flickering gaslight of the early 19th century, a new kind of mind was beginning to ask new kinds of questions about opium. It was not enough anymore to know that opium worked, that it had been used successfully for thousands of years. These new chemists wanted to know why it worked. What was the active ingredient? What was the chemical structure? Could it be isolated, purified, perhaps even improved? They wanted to dismantle the joy plant piece by piece, and find the engine of its power. They wanted to isolate what one young German pharmacist's apprentice called the principium somniferum, the sleep-inducing principle, the soul of the opium poppy. And in a small quiet town in Germany, that young man was about to do exactly that, launching a revolution in both medicine and human suffering that continues to this day. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Saturner. He was born in 1783, in the small town of Neuhaus, near Paderborn in Westphalia, a region of what would later become Germany, but was then a patchwork of small principalities and kingdoms. He was not born into wealth or privilege. His father was a minor government official who died when Friedrich was young, leaving the family in modest circumstances. The boy showed intellectual promise but lacked the means to attend university, the traditional path to scientific distinction. Instead, at age 13 he was apprenticed to a local pharmacist, a respectable trade that required education and skill but did not command the prestige of medicine or academic science. This apprenticeship, which might have seemed like a limitation, turned out to be the perfect environment for Saturner's particular genius. Working in the pharmacy, he had direct daily access to the crude drugs and chemicals that were the raw materials of early 19th century medicine. He learned to compound prescriptions, to prepare tinctures and extracts, to work with his hands as well as his mind. And unlike university professors who theorized from books, he could experiment directly with substances, testing ideas through practical work. By his early 20s, Saturner had become obsessed with a question that would consume years of his life. What made opium work? The conventional wisdom of the time, inherited from ancient medicine and accepted without question by most physicians and pharmacists, was that opium's effects came from the entire substance working together, that there was something about the combination of all its components that produced its remarkable properties. But Saturner had a different intuition. He believed that opium was not a single substance but a cocktail, a mixture of many different chemical compounds, and that one of them, perhaps just one single active ingredient, was responsible for the profound effects that had made opium medicine's most powerful weapon for thousands of years. If he could isolate that ingredient, separate it from all the other materials in crude opium, he would have something unprecedented, a pure, consistent, reliable medicine that could be measured and administered with precision. This was the dream, the holy grail of pharmaceutical chemistry. And Saturner, working alone in his modest laboratory, was determined to achieve it. Night after night, after the pharmacy had closed its doors and the streets of Paderborn grew quiet, Saturna would light his lamps and begin his experiments. The work was painstaking, tedious, and fraught with danger. He was working with poisonous substances, using techniques that were still being invented, with no safety equipment beyond simple precautions, no established protocols to follow, no mentors to guide him. If he made a mistake, if he spilled concentrated acid, or breathed toxic fumes, or accidentally dosed himself too heavily with one of his experimental compounds, he could be permanently injured or killed, and no one would even know what he had been attempting. But Saturna was possessed by that dangerous combination of curiosity and persistence that drives all great scientific discoveries. He could not let the question go. Using the crude tools of early 19th century chemistry, glass beakers and flasks, alcohol burners, simple scales, reagents like acids and bases that he prepared himself, he began a systematic chemical assault on raw opium, trying every technique he could think of or read about in the scattered chemical literature available to him. His breakthrough came after years of failed experiments. He dissolved raw opium in hot water, then added ammonia, a base that would neutralize any acids present. This caused something remarkable to happen. A substance began to precipitate out of the solution, forming tiny crystals that settled to the bottom of his flask. These crystals were unlike anything in crude opium. They were grayish-white, geometric, pure-looking. He had isolated something, but what was it? Was this the active principle he sought, or merely some inert impurity? There was only one way to find out. He had to test it. He began cautiously, with the animal experiments that were standard in early pharmacology. He administered tiny amounts of his crystalline substance to mice and stray dogs, carefully observing the effects. The results were dramatic and unmistakable. The animals would become calm, then drowsy, then fall into a deep, profound sleep that resembled death more than natural slumber. Their breathing slowed, their muscles relaxed completely, they were unresponsive to stimuli. But when they eventually awoke, hours later, they seemed unharmed, walking and eating normally. This was it, Saturna believed. This was the pure essence of opium's power, the principium somniferum that he had been seeking for years. But to be certain, to truly prove that this substance had the same effects on humans that crude opium did, he needed human test subjects. This presented an obvious problem. What he was proposing was dangerous, potentially fatal. He could not ethically ask patients or strangers to risk their lives for his experiment. The only ethical option by the standards of early 19th century science was to experiment on himself. But he went further. In 1817, in an act of scientific bravery that bordered on madness and that would never be permitted under modern ethical guidelines, Saturna recruited 3 of his friends, young men about his own age, in their late 20s or early 30s, and made himself the first test subject. They gathered one evening in his laboratory, these 4 young men, about to participate in one of the most important and dangerous experiments in the history of pharmacology. Saturna had carefully measured out doses of his crystalline compound, starting conservatively small. He explained to his friends what he believed would happen, that they would feel effects similar to taking opium, but perhaps more intense, that there might be risks he could not anticipate, but that this was necessary to advance medical knowledge. They trusted him, trusted his years of careful work, trusted that he would not take unnecessary risks. They were wrong about that last point. Each man, including Saturna himself, swallowed a dose of the crystalline powder dissolved in water. It was bitter, intensely bitter, worse than crude opium. They waited, talking nervously, wondering what would happen. 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. Nothing, no effects at all. Saturna felt a mixture of disappointment and embarrassment. Had he been wrong? Had he spent years chasing an illusion? Or was the dose simply too small? He made a decision that would haunt him and provide a cautionary tale for pharmacologists ever after. He decided to double the dose. Each man took a second portion, twice the size of the first. This time, the effects came on quickly and powerfully. Within 15 or 20 minutes, they all felt it. A warmth spread through their bodies, starting in the stomach and radiating outward to the limbs. Their muscles grew heavy, filled with a pleasant leaden sensation. The room seemed to soften. Sounds grew muffled. Time stretched out. Their thoughts slowed to a crawl, each idea taking enormous effort to form and express. They looked at each other through increasingly droopy eyelids and began to laugh, that slow, dreamy laughter of the deeply intoxicated. This was remarkable, stronger than any opium they had experienced before. But Sir Turner, in his scientific zeal, wanted more data. He wanted to see what would happen at higher doses, to map out the full range of effects. He made a decision that he would later deeply regret. He administered a third dose to all of them, larger than the previous two. The effects became violent and terrifying. The pleasant warmth and drowsiness were replaced by intense nausea that hit all four men almost simultaneously. The room began to spin, a disorienting vertigo that made standing or even sitting upright nearly impossible. Crushing headaches set in, pain so severe it was almost unbearable, a cruel irony given that this substance was supposed to relieve pain. One of Sir Turner's friends collapsed into a stupor so deep he was completely unresponsive. His skin grew pale and cool to the touch. His breathing became slow and shallow, each breath taking longer to come than the last. Sir Turner, even in his own distressed state, recognized the danger. They were experiencing an overdose, were teetering on the very edge of fatal poisoning. If his friend's breathing slowed much more, if it stopped entirely, he would die, and it would be Sir Turner's fault, his responsibility for pushing too far, fighting through his own nausea and impaired thinking. Sir Turner forced himself to act. He knew from his pharmaceutical training that vinegar, a mild acid, could help neutralize some effects of certain poisons. He prepared a strong vinegar solution and began forcing it down his friend's throat, trying to induce vomiting, to purge whatever remained in the stomach. He did the same for himself and the other two men. They vomited violently and repeatedly, bringing up the crystalline compound mixed with stomach contents. Gradually, over the course of hours that must have felt like an eternity, the crisis passed. All four survived, though they were sick and miserable for days afterward. Despite the near disaster, the experiment was scientifically a success. Sir Turner had proven beyond doubt that he had isolated an active principle from opium, a pure substance that produced the characteristic effects of the crude drug, but with far greater potency. He had also demonstrated something that would become crucially important for medical use, the dose-response relationship, the way that effects intensified with larger doses and eventually became toxic. He wrote up his findings carefully, documenting his methods and results, and submitted them for publication in 1817. He named his discovery Morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams and son of Hypnos, the god of sleep. It was a fitting tribute to the ancient understanding of opium's powers, linking his modern scientific discovery to thousands of years of medical history. The name would later be standardized to morphine, but Sir Turner's choice of nomenclature revealed his understanding that he had not created something entirely new but rather had isolated and purified something that had been hidden in the poppy all along, the essence of a power that ancient physicians had recognized without being able to explain. The initial reaction to Sir Turner's discovery was disappointing. He was an unknown pharmacist from a provincial town, without university credentials or connections to the major scientific institutions of Europe. His paper was published in an obscure German journal that few scientists read. The leading chemists and physicians of the day, working in universities and academies in Paris, London, and other major centers, either never heard of his work or dismissed it as the unverified claims of an amateur. For several years, Sir Turner's discovery languished in obscurity, known only to a few specialists. But gradually, as other chemists attempted to replicate his work and succeeded, as his results were confirmed by more prestigious researchers, the significance of what he had achieved began to be recognized. In 1831, the great French chemist Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac, one of the founders of modern chemistry, wrote about Sir Turner's work in glowing terms, calling it a breakthrough of the first importance. Gay-Lussac proposed that morphine represented an entirely new class of substances, plant alkaloids, organic bases that could be extracted from plants that possessed powerful physiological effects. This opened up a new field of pharmaceutical research. If morphine could be isolated from opium, what other active principles might be hidden in medicinal plants? Over the following decades, chemists would isolate quinine from cinchona bark, used to treat malaria, atropine from belladonna, cocaine from coca leaves, and dozens of other alkaloids, each with important medical applications. Pharmaceutical companies quickly recognized the commercial potential of pure morphine. The German company Merck, which had been making medicines since the 17th century, began commercial production of morphine in the 1820s. Other companies followed. By the 1830s, morphine was available to physicians throughout Europe and increasingly in North America. The impact on medical practice was revolutionary and immediate. For the first time in history, doctors had a painkiller of known and absolutely consistent purity and potency. No longer did they have to worry about whether their opium was fresh or stale, pure or adulterated, weak or dangerously strong. A grain of morphine purchased from a reputable pharmaceutical company in London was chemically identical to a grain purchased in Paris, Vienna, New York, or any other city with access to modern pharmaceutical suppliers. Doctors could consult published tables showing standard doses for adults and children. For different types of pain and different methods of administration, they could prescribe with confidence, knowing that their patient would receive exactly the intended dose. This standardization was a crucial step toward making medicine a true science rather than an art based on tradition and guesswork. The potency of pure morphine compared to crude opium was remarkable. Morphine was approximately 10 times stronger than opium on a weight basis, meaning that 1 grain of morphine produced the same effects as 10 grains of opium. This had several practical advantages. First, patients needed to take much smaller amounts to achieve relief, making administration easier and side effects like nausea less common. Second, the higher potency meant that a small vial of morphine contained as much therapeutic power as a much larger container of opium, making it more convenient for physicians to carry in their medical bags and for pharmacists to stock. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the consistent potency eliminated the dangerous guesswork that had characterized opium use for centuries. Physicians learned through experience and published studies what doses of morphine were appropriate for different conditions and different patients. Medical textbooks began including specific morphine prescribing guidelines. An entire science of posology, the study of drug dosing, developed around morphine and other newly isolated alkaloids. The therapeutic applications of morphine seemed almost unlimited. It transformed the practice of surgery, which before the mid-19th century had been an agonizing ordeal that patients feared almost as much as the conditions that required it. Surgeons had to work with terrible speed, amputating a limb or removing a tumor, or performing other operations in a matter of minutes while strong men held down the screaming patient. The development of anesthesia in the 1840s, using ether or chloroform, allowed patients to sleep through surgery without feeling the initial pain, but they still experienced severe pain afterward during recovery. Morphine provided the answer. Post-surgical patients could be given regular doses of morphine to control their pain during the critical recovery period, allowing them to rest, eat, and heal without the debilitating effects of severe suffering. Cancer patients facing terminal illness with severe bone pain or other painful symptoms found relief that made their remaining time more bearable. Victims of severe injuries, fractures, burns, internal injuries, could be given morphine to prevent fatal shock and allow the body's healing processes to operate without the interference of overwhelming pain signals. Patients with severe chronic conditions like neuralgia, kidney stones, or advanced arthritis finally had access to effective pain relief. The list went on and on. Morphine appeared to be an unalloyed miracle, a pure triumph of science over suffering, of modern chemistry over ancient crude remedies. Medical journals published enthusiastic articles about morphine's benefits. Doctors wrote testimonials about dramatic cases where morphine had saved lives or restored quality of life. Pharmaceutical companies advertised their morphine products as the pinnacle of modern medicine. The substance acquired an almost magical reputation, seen as the solution to one of humanity's oldest and most persistent problems. There seemed to be no downside, no dark side to this miracle, or rather the dark side was present but not yet recognized, not yet fully understood. Hints appeared in medical literature, scattered reports that some patients who took morphine regularly seemed to need ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effects, that they became uncomfortable or ill when they tried to stop taking it. Doctors noted these observations but did not yet have a framework to understand what they were seeing. The concept of addiction as we understand it today did not exist in early 19th century medicine. There was no recognition that a medicine could change the brain in fundamental ways, creating a dependence that went far beyond the original condition being treated. Some physicians wrote about patients who had become habituated to morphine, needing it constantly even when their original painful condition had healed. These doctors puzzled over this phenomenon. Was the pain somehow returning? Was there some chronic condition they had failed to diagnose? Or was something else happening? Something new and not fully understood. A few perceptive physicians began to suspect that morphine itself was creating a new kind of illness, a syndrome of dependence where the body adapted to the constant presence of the drug and could no longer function normally without it. When these patients tried to stop taking morphine, they experienced a constellation of deeply unpleasant symptoms: anxiety and restlessness, muscle aches and pains, sweating and chills, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia, and perhaps most significantly, an overwhelming craving for more morphine. These symptoms would begin within hours of the last dose and intensify over several days, becoming so severe that most patients could not endure them, and resumed taking morphine simply to feel normal again. This was not the original pain returning. This was something entirely new, a sickness caused by the absence of a drug that the body had come to depend on. A few pioneering physicians recognized this as a distinct medical condition and gave it various names: morphinism, narcomania, the morphine habit. But understanding was limited, and treatment options were almost non-existent. The medical profession struggled to understand why some patients developed morphinism while others seemed able to use morphine for legitimate pain and then stop without difficulty when the pain resolved. The prevailing theory, influenced by Victorian morality and limited understanding of brain chemistry, was that morphine addiction was primarily a moral failure, a weakness of will. Strong-minded individuals, this theory held, could use morphine appropriately for medical purposes and then discontinue it when no longer needed. Weak-minded individuals lacked this self-control and fell into the morphine habit through their own character flaws. This moralistic view, which we now recognize as completely wrong and harmful, dominated medical and public understanding for decades and contributed to the stigmatization of addiction that continues to cause problems today. A few physicians took a more compassionate and scientific approach, recognizing that morphinism appeared to be a genuine disease state affecting the nervous system, that patients were not choosing to be addicted, but were experiencing a physical condition beyond their conscious control. But these enlightened voices were in the minority. Most doctors accepted the moral weakness theory and treated morphine addicts with disapproval and often refused to prescribe the very drug that would relieve their suffering. The stage was being set for a crisis, but it would take a war to make it undeniable. That war came in 1861, when tensions between North and South over slavery and states' rights finally erupted into armed conflict. The American Civil War would become a turning point not just in American history, but in the history of drug addiction as well. And a new technology was about to make morphine even more dangerous and addictive than it had been before. The hypodermic syringe was about to meet the battlefield, with consequences that would echo for generations. The hypodermic syringe, that simple medical device that we now take for granted, that seems almost primitive in its basic design, represented one of the most significant technological advances in the history of medicine. Unlike many revolutionary technologies, it was developed almost simultaneously by two people working independently on opposite sides of Europe, neither initially aware of the other's work. In Scotland, a physician named Alexander Wood was treating patients with severe neuralgia, a condition causing chronic nerve pain that was often resistant to oral medications. Wood reasoned that if he could deliver morphine directly to the site of pain, bypassing the digestive system entirely, it might be more effective. In 1853, he developed a hollow needle attached to a simple plunger mechanism that could inject morphine solution directly into tissue near painful nerves. At almost exactly the same time, in France, a surgeon named Charles Gabriel Provaz was developing a similar device for delivering medication and for extracting fluids from cysts and abscesses. By the late 1850s, both designs had been refined and were beginning to be adopted by forward-thinking physicians across Europe and North America. The hypodermic syringe was about to transform medicine in ways that its inventors could not have anticipated, some beneficial, others catastrophic. The innovation was profound and simple. When morphine was taken orally, swallowed as a pill or liquid, it had to pass through the stomach and intestines, where it was partially broken down by digestive enzymes and stomach acid. What remained had to be absorbed through the intestinal walls into the bloodstream, then pass through the liver, where more was metabolized before the drug finally reached the brain and other organs where it exerted its effects. This process, called first-pass metabolism, meant that a significant portion of an oral morphine dose was lost before it could produce therapeutic effects. The onset of action was slow, typically taking 30 minutes to an hour for the patient to feel relief. The peak effects came even later, perhaps 2 to 3 hours after ingestion. This was acceptable for chronic pain management, or when time was not critical, but it was frustratingly slow in emergency situations or for severe acute pain. When morphine was injected under the skin, called subcutaneous injection, or into muscle tissue, called intramuscular injection, the drug was absorbed directly into the bloodstream without passing through the digestive system or liver. The onset of action was much faster, typically within 5 to 15 minutes. The peak effects came within 30 minutes to an hour, and because the drug bypassed first-pass metabolism, the same dose produced more intense effects. But even more significant was what happened when morphine was injected directly into a vein, called intravenous injection. This technique, more difficult and dangerous but far more powerful, delivered the drug directly into the circulatory system. The morphine reached the brain in seconds, producing an almost instantaneous effect. Patients who experienced intravenous morphine, particularly those receiving it for the first time, described something that oral morphine users rarely mentioned: a rush, an intense wave of euphoria that began within seconds of injection and spread through the body like warm honey. This rush was followed immediately by the profound sense of well-being, contentment, and relief from pain that characterized all opioid effects. But the sudden intensity of the experience was qualitatively different from anything achieved by oral administration. The rush was caused by the rapid rise in brain morphine levels, going from zero to peak in just a few seconds rather than slowly climbing over an hour. This created an intense reinforcement, a powerful association in the brain between the act of injection and the pleasurable effects, making the behavior far more likely to be repeated. Modern neuroscience understands this now. The speed of drug delivery to the brain is one of the most important factors in determining addiction potential. A drug that produces effects slowly tends to be less addictive than the same drug delivered rapidly. Intravenous morphine was far more addictive than oral morphine. Not because the morphine molecule itself was different, but because the method of delivery created a much stronger reinforcement in the brain's reward circuits. Alexander Wood, who pioneered the subcutaneous injection of morphine, initially believed that his technique would actually reduce the risk of addiction. His reasoning, which seems bizarre in retrospect, but made sense given the limited understanding of the time, was that addiction came from introducing the drug into the stomach and digestive system. If morphine was injected directly into tissues, he theorized, patients would get pain relief without developing the morphine habit. He could not have been more wrong. In fact, injectable morphine proved far more addictive than oral morphine, and Wood himself would later witness tragic proof of this. His own wife, suffering from chronic pain and treated extensively with morphine injections, became severely addicted and eventually died from the consequences of her addiction, making her one of the first documented cases of death from injectable morphine dependence. Wood was devastated by this outcome, and spent his later years warning about the addiction potential of injectable opioids, but by then the technology had spread widely and the damage was done. Thousands of physicians had adopted the hypodermic syringe, seeing it as a modern improvement over old-fashioned oral medications, unaware that they were creating addiction in their patients at unprecedented rates. The American Civil War, which began in April 1861 and would not end until April 1865, arrived at the perfect moment to demonstrate both the benefits and the terrible costs of injectable morphine. This was the first truly modern war, fought with industrial-age weapons that produced casualties on a scale that shocked even experienced military men. The rifle musket, with its grooved barrel that gave the bullet spin and therefore accuracy and range, replaced the old smoothbore muskets that had been used in previous conflicts. These new weapons were accurate at several hundred yards, meaning that traditional tactics of massing troops and charging across open ground toward enemy positions had become suicidal. But military commanders, trained in the old ways, were slow to adapt to this new reality. The result was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Massed infantry advancing against entrenched troops armed with rifled muskets and artillery were cut down in enormous numbers, often before they could even reach the enemy lines. The battles of the Civil War produced casualty lists that seem almost incomprehensible. At Antietam in September 1862, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day of fighting, the bloodiest day in American military history. At Gettysburg in July 1863, the three-day battle produced over 50,000 casualties. These were not just numbers in official reports. These were young men, many still teenagers, with shattered limbs, gaping wounds, internal injuries that pre-antibiotic medicine could barely comprehend, let alone treat effectively. The weapons of the Civil War were particularly devastating to the human body. The Minié ball, the standard bullet used by both sides, was a soft lead projectile, larger and heavier than modern bullets, that traveled at relatively low velocity compared to later firearms. When it struck flesh, it did not pass cleanly through like a modern high-velocity bullet. Instead, it tumbled and flattened on impact, creating massive tissue damage. When it hit bone, which was frequent given the bullet's size and the common practice of aiming for the center of mass, it shattered the bone into fragments that themselves became projectiles, driving into surrounding tissue and carrying cloth and dirt deep into the wound. The resulting injuries were horrific: compound fractures with bones protruding through skin, massive soft tissue damage, contamination of wounds with battlefield debris that ensured infection in an era before antibiotics or even basic antiseptic technique. The standard surgical response was amputation, removing the damaged limb as quickly as possible to prevent the spread of gangrene that would otherwise kill the patient within days. Civil War surgeons, working in field hospitals that were little more than tents or commandeered buildings near the battlefield, performed amputations on an industrial scale, sometimes dozens in a single day. The piles of severed limbs outside surgical tents became one of the war's most horrific and enduring images. Pain management was a critical challenge for the Army Medical Corps. Soldiers waiting for treatment, lying on blood-soaked cots or simply on the ground, screaming in agony from wounds that might not be treated for hours or even days given the overwhelming numbers, needed something to make their suffering bearable. Soldiers undergoing amputation needed anesthesia, typically chloroform or ether, to make them unconscious during the procedure. And soldiers recovering from surgery, or from wounds that did not require amputation, needed ongoing pain management during the days and weeks of recovery. The Army's answer to all these problems was morphine, issued in quantities that were staggering by peacetime standards. The Union Army Medical Department, which kept better records than their Confederate counterparts, purchased and distributed approximately 10 million opium pills and nearly 300,000 ounces of opium powder and morphine during the war years. This is a conservative estimate based on surviving procurement records, and the actual quantities were likely higher. Individual medical officers carried morphine in their bags as one of their most essential supplies, more important than bandages or surgical instruments, because it was morphine that made the unbearable bearable, that prevented men from dying of shock before they could receive treatment, that allowed surgeons to work on patients who would otherwise be thrashing in agony. The adoption of the hypodermic syringe by military surgeons during the Civil War represented a major shift in how morphine was administered. Early in the war, morphine was typically given orally, as pills or powder dissolved in water or whiskey. But as hypodermic syringes became available, purchased from European medical suppliers or manufactured by nascent American medical device companies, military surgeons quickly recognized their advantages. A wounded man in shock, vomiting from pain, could not keep down oral medications, but injected morphine worked even when the patient could not swallow. The rapid onset meant that relief came in minutes rather than the half-hour or more that oral morphine required. For surgeons working under battlefield conditions, dealing with dozens or hundreds of casualties, this speed was crucial. They could inject morphine and move on to the next patient, knowing that relief would come quickly. The practice became so common that some soldiers learned to inject themselves or their comrades, using captured medical supplies or syringes pilfered from field hospitals. The hypodermic syringe and morphine became inseparable, a life-saving combination that was distributed throughout the Union and Confederate armies with little thought given to long-term consequences. The short-term benefits were undeniable and dramatic. Morphine saved lives, prevented deaths from shock, made surgery possible, allowed wounded men to endure transport from battlefield to field hospital to general hospital. It was a mercy and a necessity, but the long-term consequences were catastrophic. When the war finally ended in April 1865, after 4 years of unimaginable carnage and over 600,000 military deaths, the surviving soldiers went home. Many carried visible wounds, missing limbs, horrific scars, permanent disabilities, but many more carried invisible wounds, trauma, what we would now call PTSD, and addiction. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of Civil War veterans had been treated with morphine for weeks or months, had received regular injections during their recovery, had been discharged from military hospitals, still taking morphine because their wounds had not fully healed or their pain had not resolved. Many had been given morphine supplies and even syringes to take home with them, with instructions to continue treatment as needed. The military doctors who prescribed these continuing supplies saw it as simple medical care, ensuring that veterans had access to the pain relief they needed. They did not understand, or chose not to acknowledge, that they were creating and sustaining addiction on a massive scale. The veterans found as they attempted to resume normal civilian life that they could not function without their medicine. The morphine was no longer just treating physical pain, it had become necessary for them to feel normal, to get through the day, to avoid the terrible sickness that came when they tried to stop. They had developed physical dependence. Their bodies and brains adapted to the constant presence of morphine so thoroughly that the absence of the drug created a withdrawal syndrome of terrible intensity. The symptoms were both physical and psychological. Physically, withdrawal caused sweating and chills, muscle aches that could be more intense than the original injury pain, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, increased sensitivity to pain, rapid heartbeat, elevated blood pressure. Psychologically, it caused anxiety that could reach panic levels, profound dysphoria and depression, irritability and agitation, and most significantly, an overwhelming craving for morphine that dominated every thought. These symptoms would begin within hours of the last dose, intensify over several days, reaching a peak around day 3 or 4, then gradually subside over a week or two. But even after the acute withdrawal symptoms resolved, many veterans experienced protracted withdrawal, a state of subtle dysfunction that could last months, characterized by low energy, disturbed sleep, emotional flatness, and ongoing vulnerability to craving, especially when stressed or reminded of drug use. Most veterans faced with this reality simply continued using morphine. They had little choice. The problem became so widespread and so obviously connected to military service that it acquired a name that acknowledged its origins: the soldier's disease or the army disease. Medical journals began publishing articles about morphine addiction among veterans, describing case after case of men whose lives had been destroyed not by their battlefield wounds, but by the medicine used to treat those wounds. Some veterans managed to maintain relatively normal lives despite their addiction, holding jobs and supporting families while secretly continuing to use morphine, purchasing supplies from sympathetic pharmacists or physicians, organizing their lives around ensuring access to the drug they needed. Others descended into complete dysfunction, unable to work, their morphine use escalating to levels that consumed all their money and time, their health deteriorating from the effects of chronic use, and from the unsanitary injection practices common in an era before sterilization was understood. Some turned to crime to support their habits. Others died, from overdoses, or from infections caused by dirty needles, or from the general health decline that accompanied severe addiction. The exact numbers will never be known, but historians estimate that between 100,000 and 400,000 Civil War veterans suffered from morphine addiction, a range so wide because reliable records were not kept, and because addiction was stigmatized, causing many cases to be hidden or misreported. The soldier's disease was America's first addiction epidemic, the first time that drug dependence affected such a large proportion of the population that it could not be ignored or dismissed as a problem limited to moral defectives or social outcasts. These were veterans, men who had served their country, who had suffered terrible wounds in its service. They had been given morphine by military doctors following official medical protocols. Their addiction was clearly iatrogenic, caused by medical treatment, not by moral failure or hedonistic drug seeking. This challenged the prevailing moralistic view of addiction as primarily a character weakness. Some physicians began to recognize that addiction might be a medical condition, a disease state that affected the brain and required treatment rather than moral condemnation. But this more enlightened view was slow to gain acceptance and would not become dominant for many decades. Most physicians continued to view morphine addicts, even veteran addicts, with disapproval, and refused to prescribe the drug for them, forcing them to buy from the black market or from unscrupulous sources. The soldier's disease persisted for decades after the war ended, with aging veterans continuing to struggle with addiction well into the early 20th century, many dying in poverty and obscurity, forgotten casualties of a war that had ended decades earlier. This widespread addiction, affecting hundreds of thousands of Americans, finally began to generate concern within the medical profession and among social reformers. Medical journals published more and more articles about morphinism, debating its causes and treatments. Some physicians recognized that the problem was partly iatrogenic, caused by overprescribing by doctors who did not understand the addictive properties of the substances they were recommending. Others continued to blame patient weakness or moral failing, arguing that proper-minded people could use morphine appropriately and then stop without difficulty. Regardless of the theoretical understanding, there was general agreement on one point: morphine addiction was a serious problem that was not going away on its own. The search began in earnest for solutions. Some physicians experimented with slow dose reduction, tapering patients off morphine gradually to minimize withdrawal symptoms. Others tried abrupt cessation, believing that willpower and endurance were required to break the habit. Neither approach was particularly successful. Most addicts either could not complete the withdrawal process or relapse soon after, returning to morphine use within weeks or months. A few specialized addiction treatment facilities opened, sanatoriums where addicts could be isolated from drug supplies and put through withdrawal under medical supervision. These had limited success and were expensive, affordable only to the wealthy. The vast majority of morphine addicts received no treatment at all, and continued using until death, sometimes from old age or unrelated causes, sometimes from the long-term health effects of chronic opioid use. The medical community and pharmaceutical industry began to search for alternatives, for a painkiller that would have morphine's benefits without its addictive properties. This was the holy grail, the solution that would solve the morphine crisis and restore medicine's tarnished reputation. Chemists experimented with modifications to the morphine molecule, hoping that small structural changes might preserve analgesic effects while eliminating addiction potential. This line of research was based on an optimistic but ultimately incorrect assumption that addiction and analgesia were separable properties, that it would be possible to create an opioid that relieved pain without producing dependence. We now know this is almost certainly impossible, that the same neurological mechanisms that create pain relief also create the adaptation and dependence that lead to addiction. But late 19th century chemists did not know this. They believed that careful chemical modification might produce a miracle drug, and in the laboratories of a rising German pharmaceutical giant, a team of scientists believed they were about to succeed. They were working for a company called Bayer, and they were about to unleash heroin on the world. The setting for the next chapter of this story was not a battlefield or a doctor's office, but a place of industrial ambition and scientific progress. Elberfeld, Germany, in the last years of the 19th century. The city, located in the Wupper River Valley in what was then Prussia, had become a center of German chemical industry, home to factories that were transforming the nation's economy and establishing Germany as a world leader in industrial chemistry. The protagonist of this chapter was not a person but a corporation, Friedrich Bayer and Company, founded in 1863 by Friedrich Bayer and Johann Friedrich Westcott. Bayer had begun as a dye manufacturer, one of many German companies that had built their fortunes on synthetic dyes, those brilliant colors that could be produced from coal tar, the black sticky waste product of coal gasification. This might seem an unlikely origin for a pharmaceutical company, but the connection was closer than one might think. The chemical processes used to synthesize dyes from coal tar were similar to those used to create pharmaceutical compounds. The skills, equipment, and scientific knowledge required for one could be applied to the other. By the 1880s, many German dye companies were diversifying into pharmaceuticals, recognizing that medicines offered higher profit margins than dyes, and that the growing understanding of chemistry opened up possibilities for creating new drugs that had never existed in nature. Bayer's pharmaceutical division, established in 1888, quickly became one of the company's most important and profitable operations. The division was led by ambitious chemists and pharmacologists who saw themselves as pioneers, using modern science to improve on nature's remedies, to create drugs that were purer, more effective, safer than anything that had come before. They worked in well-equipped laboratories, had access to the latest chemical literature from universities and research institutions worldwide, and were backed by substantial corporate resources that allowed them to pursue long-term research projects. The company culture encouraged innovation and rewarded success with bonuses and promotions. Scientists who developed profitable new drugs could become wealthy and famous. This created a highly competitive environment where researchers pushed hard to be the first to develop breakthrough medications. One of Bayer's early pharmaceutical successes was phenacetin, an analgesic and fever reducer introduced in 1888. that became widely used and generated substantial revenue. But Bayer's researchers had more ambitious goals. They wanted to develop a truly revolutionary painkiller, something that would surpass morphine and establish Bayer as the world leader in analgesic research. They wanted to create a drug that doctors would prefer over morphine, that patients would request by name, that would generate profits for decades. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. In 1874, more than 2 decades before Bayer's pharmaceutical division became seriously interested in opioid research, an English chemist named C.R. Alder Wright, working at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in London, had conducted experiments on morphine derivatives. Wright was interested in the fundamental chemistry of alkaloids, trying to understand their molecular structure and how modifications might change their properties. He took pure morphine and boiled it with acetic anhydride, a simple chemical process that added 2 acetyl groups to the morphine molecule. The result was a new compound, diacetyl morphine, that appeared as white crystalline powder, similar in appearance to morphine but with a different molecular structure. Wright tested his new compound on dogs, carefully documenting their responses. The effects were dramatic and disturbing. The dogs showed severe symptoms: restlessness, terror, extreme motor activity, salivation, and eventually stupor. Some appeared to be in significant distress. Wright's notes, published in 1874 in a scientific journal, described these results objectively, but expressed no particular enthusiasm for his creation. He saw it as an interesting academic finding, but not as something with obvious practical applications. The paper attracted little attention at the time. Wright moved on to other research, and diacetyl morphine was largely forgotten, sitting in the published scientific literature, available to anyone who cared to look but drawing no special interest. It would remain in obscurity for nearly a quarter century, until Bayer's researchers discovered it. In the 1890s, Bayer's pharmaceutical division, looking for new opioid compounds to develop, began a systematic review of the scientific literature on morphine derivatives. A young pharmacologist named Heinrich Dresser, who had joined Bayer in 1895 and quickly established himself as one of the company's most talented researchers, came across Wright's 1874 paper describing diacetyl morphine. Dresser was intrigued. Wright's animal experiments had shown powerful effects, suggesting high potency, but the testing had been limited, and the results had never been followed up. Dresser convinced his superiors to let him investigate further, working with the company's chemists, who synthesized fresh batches of diacetyl morphine using Wright's method. Dresser began a comprehensive research program to evaluate the compound's potential as a medicine. He started with animal studies, testing the substance on rabbits, guinea pigs, and mice, carefully measuring doses and observing effects. His results differed significantly from Wright's. Rather than seeing terror and distress, Dresser observed what appeared to be effective pain relief and sedation at appropriate doses. The discrepancy might have resulted from differences in dosing, in the purity of the compounds in the animal species used, or in subjective interpretation of animal behavior. Whatever the reason, Dresser's results were encouraging enough to proceed to the next stage, human trials. Human trials in the 1890s were conducted very differently than they would be today. There were no institutional review boards, no informed consent requirements, no elaborate protocols designed to protect subject safety and rights. Researchers like Dresser simply recruited volunteers, often employees of the company or patients from local hospitals, explained in general terms what they were testing, and administered the experimental drug while observing effects. Dresser tested diacetyl morphine on himself first, following the tradition established by Serturner nearly a century earlier of researchers self-experimenting with new drugs. He took a small dose and waited. The effects came on quickly, more rapidly than morphine typically acted when taken orally. He felt a slight warmth, a sense of well-being, and notable pain relief. He had been suffering from a minor injury that gave him an opportunity to assess analgesic effects. Most significantly, he felt alert and energized rather than sedated, one of morphine's frequent side effects that patients often complained about. The experience was positive enough that he proceeded to test on other subjects. Over the following months, Dresser conducted tests on dozens of volunteers, gradually establishing what he believed were safe and effective doses. He gave diacetyl morphine to patients suffering from tuberculosis, noting that it seemed to suppress their chronic coughing more effectively than codeine, the standard cough suppressant of the era. This was particularly significant. Tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death in the late 19th century, a disease with no effective treatment that killed millions. The constant severe coughing that accompanied advanced tuberculosis was not just a symptom but a serious problem in itself, causing sleep deprivation, exhaustion, and spreading the infection to others. A truly effective cough suppressant for tuberculosis patients would be tremendously valuable. Dreser also tested the compound on patients with various painful conditions, on asthma sufferers, on people recovering from surgery. His results, at least as he interpreted and reported them, were consistently positive. Patients reported good pain relief, effective cough suppression, and fewer side effects than they experienced with morphine. Some said they felt energized rather than sedated, able to continue normal activities while taking the medication. Dreser noted minimal respiratory depression, the dangerous suppression of breathing that was one of morphine's most serious adverse effects, and that caused most opioid overdose deaths. Most remarkably, and most fatefully for what would follow, Dreser believed he had evidence that diacetylmorphine was not addictive, or at least less addictive than morphine. He gave the drug to several morphine addicts, people who were already dependent on morphine and suffering from their addiction. These patients reported that diacetylmorphine satisfied their cravings and allowed them to function without needing morphine. Dreser interpreted this as evidence that diacetylmorphine could be used to treat morphine addiction, that it could substitute for morphine without itself causing dependence. This interpretation was profoundly wrong, based on a misunderstanding of addiction that seems almost willfully ignorant in retrospect. What Dreser was actually observing was cross-tolerance. Diacetylmorphine and morphine acted on the same brain receptors, so one could substitute for the other, temporarily relieving withdrawal symptoms. But this did not mean that diacetylmorphine was non-addictive. It simply meant that it could replace morphine in someone already addicted to opioids. If anything, the fact that it could satisfy morphine cravings suggested it had similar addiction potential. But Dreser either did not understand this, or chose not to acknowledge it. His published papers on diacetylmorphine, which appeared in medical journals in 1898 and 1899, emphasized the compound's therapeutic benefits while downplaying or ignoring warning signs about addiction potential. Armed with Dreser's research and supremely confident in their new drug, Bayer made the decision to launch it commercially. They needed a name, something memorable and marketable, something that would convey the drug's power and benefits. The German word Heroin means heroic, suggesting strength and power. Company marketers, working with Dreser and other researchers, coined the brand name Heroin, evoking heroic strength and the idea that this drug would make patients feel strong and capable, rather than weak and sedated. It was a brilliant piece of branding, a name that suggested everything positive about the compound, while revealing nothing about its dangers. In 1898, Bayer launched Heroin commercially, backed by an aggressive marketing campaign, unlike anything the pharmaceutical industry had seen before. The company produced elaborate advertisements showing well-dressed patients, happy and healthy-looking, taking their heroin medication. They created promotional materials for doctors, offering free samples and detailed prescribing information. They published scientific papers, some authored by Dreser himself and others by physicians who had been given free supplies of heroin to test on their patients, touting the drug's benefits. They emphasized several key selling points that would appear repeatedly in heroin marketing over the next decade and more. First, heroin was marketed as a powerful cough suppressant, superior to codeine or any other available medication. Bayer claimed it was 10 times more effective than codeine at suppressing cough, making it the treatment of choice for tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis, and any other condition involving severe or chronic coughing. Second, it was promoted as a superior analgesic, providing pain relief equivalent to morphine but with fewer side effects, particularly less sedation and constipation. Third, and most dangerously, it was marketed as non-addictive, or at least far less addictive than morphine. Bayer's promotional materials explicitly stated that heroin could be used freely without fear of creating dependence, that it was safe for long-term use, that it could even be used to cure morphine addiction by allowing addicts to transition to a safer alternative. Fourth, it was presented as safe for children, with specific pediatric dosing guidelines provided to physicians. Bayer advertised heroin for treating children's coughs, including the severe whooping cough that killed thousands of children annually. The advertisements showed children, some appearing to be infants or toddlers, being given heroin by attentive mothers or caring physicians. This marketing to children, which would be unthinkable today for an opioid medication, was seen as perfectly appropriate at the time, reflecting medicine's casual attitude toward giving powerful drugs to pediatric patients. The marketing campaign was extraordinarily successful. Within a year of its launch, Heroin was being sold in 23 countries on every continent. Bayer could barely keep up with demand. The company's factory in Elberfeld ran day and night producing heroin, expanding production capacity as orders flooded in from pharmacies, hospitals, and physicians' offices worldwide. Heroin was available in multiple forms to suit different uses and patient preferences. It came as a white powder that could be dissolved in water for injection or mixed into syrups for oral administration. It was sold in tablets and lozenges that could be dissolved slowly in the mouth for sustained effect. It was formulated into cough syrups and elixirs, often combined with other medications like expectorants or flavoring agents to improve palatability. Bayer even produced heroin in pediatric formulations specifically designed for children, with lower concentrations and child-friendly flavors. The packaging was elegant and professional, designed to convey scientific sophistication and medical authority. Bottles bore the Bayer name prominently, and displayed the trademarked heroin brand in distinctive typography. Physicians received detailed prescribing guides, explaining appropriate doses for different conditions, different ages, different routes of administration. Doctors embraced heroin enthusiastically, seeing it as a significant advance over existing medications. It worked quickly and effectively for conditions that had been difficult to treat. Patients reported satisfaction with the relief it provided. The claims about low addiction potential were especially appealing, addressing one of the major concerns that had made many physicians reluctant to prescribe morphine too freely. If heroin truly was less addictive, as Bayer and the medical literature claimed, then doctors could prescribe it liberally without worrying about creating morphine-like dependency in their patients. General practitioners prescribed heroin for chronic cough. Pediatricians gave it to children with whooping cough or other respiratory infections. Surgeons prescribed it for post-operative pain. It became especially popular for treating tuberculosis, prescribed to hundreds of thousands of TB patients worldwide. Some doctors even followed Bayer's recommendation to use heroin to treat morphine addiction, transitioning their morphine-dependent patients to heroin in the belief that they were helping them escape addiction. For several years, heroin was considered one of modern medicine's great triumphs, proof that scientific research could improve on nature and solve problems that had plagued humanity for generations. But some physicians and pharmacologists were less enthusiastic, expressing concerns that were largely ignored in the initial wave of heroin enthusiasm. A few researchers noted that heroin's chemical structure was very similar to morphine, differing only by those two acetyl groups that Alder Wright had added back in 1874. They questioned how such a small modification could completely eliminate addictive properties while preserving therapeutic effects. Some clinicians reported that patients taking heroin for chronic conditions seemed to need increasing doses over time, a classic sign of tolerance development that often preceded dependence. There were scattered reports of patients who had difficulty stopping heroin after taking it regularly for weeks or months, experiencing symptoms reminiscent of morphine withdrawal. These warning signs were dismissed by Bayer and by many in the medical community. The negative reports were attributed to individual patient problems, to inappropriate prescribing, to concurrent use of other drugs. Bayer continued to insist that heroin was safe and non-addictive when used as directed. The company's scientific prestige, the positive reports from thousands of physicians, and the obvious therapeutic benefits all argued against the scattered concerns. What was actually happening, though it would take several more years for the truth to become undeniable, was that heroin was rapidly converting to morphine in the body. Those two acetyl groups that distinguished heroin from morphine were not permanent. Enzymes in the blood and liver stripped them away, converting heroin back into morphine within minutes of administration. This explained many of heroin's properties. It explained why it seemed to work faster than morphine, heroin being more fat-soluble than morphine, because of those acetyl groups crossed the blood-brain barrier more rapidly, entering the brain within seconds of injection. Once in the brain, enzymes quickly converted it to morphine, which then produced the familiar opioid effects by binding to the same receptors that morphine activated. Heroin was essentially a prodrug, a way of delivering morphine to the brain more rapidly and efficiently than administering morphine directly. This explained why heroin could substitute for morphine in dependent individuals. It was metabolizing into morphine, giving them exactly what their bodies were addicted to. It also explained why heroin appeared less sedating in some circumstances. The rapid onset and high initial brain concentrations produced by efficient blood-brain barrier crossing created different subjective effects than slower-acting oral morphine. But these were effects of delivery speed, not fundamental differences in the molecule's actions. The addiction potential that Dresser had dismissed or failed to observe was very real, and was actually worse than morphine's. The rapid blood-brain barrier crossing that made heroin act so quickly also made it more reinforcing, creating stronger associations in the brain's reward circuits between drug administration and pleasurable effects. Users who injected heroin experienced an intense rush of euphoria within seconds, far more intense than anything produced by oral morphine, or even by injected morphine, which crossed the blood-brain barrier more slowly. This rapid reinforcement made heroin extraordinarily addictive, even more so than the morphine it was supposed to replace. The tolerance that developed with chronic use was also problematic. Users needed increasing doses to achieve the same effects, and the doses that patients eventually required could be many times higher than initial therapeutic doses. When they tried to stop, or when circumstances forced them to stop, they experienced withdrawal symptoms identical to morphine withdrawal, but often described as subjectively more severe, possibly because the rapid fluctuations in brain opioid levels produced by heroin's quick action created more dramatic neurological adaptation. By the early 1900s, just a few years after heroin's launch, the evidence of problems was accumulating too rapidly to be ignored. Medical journals began publishing case reports of heroin addiction, describing patients who had been prescribed the drug for legitimate medical reasons and had become dependent, unable to stop using despite wanting to, their lives increasingly dominated by their need for the drug. Clinics that treated morphine addicts reported seeing more and more patients whose primary drug of abuse was heroin, not morphine. Some were former morphine addicts who had been prescribed heroin as a cure for their morphine addiction, only to become addicted to heroin instead. Others were people with no history of opioid use who had been prescribed heroin for cough or pain, and developed dependence. The patterns were disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied the morphine addiction crisis of previous decades. Patients required escalating doses. They experienced withdrawal symptoms when they stopped. They continued using despite negative consequences. They organized their lives around obtaining and using the drug. The only difference was that heroin addiction seemed to develop faster and be more severe than morphine addiction, exactly the opposite of what Bayer had promised. The medical community's growing recognition of heroin's addiction potential led to increasingly critical articles in medical journals. By 1905, just 7 years after heroin's introduction, numerous papers had documented its addictive properties convincingly. The American Medical Association began warning physicians about overprescribing heroin. Medical textbooks that had initially praised the drug began including warnings about dependency risks. Some prominent physicians publicly recanted their earlier enthusiasm and called for restrictions on heroin prescribing. In 1906, the American Medical Association formally approved a resolution stating that heroin should be subject to the same precautions as morphine, and should not be prescribed without careful consideration of addiction risks. This was a significant reversal of the medical profession's initial embrace of the drug, an acknowledgement that the pharmaceutical industry's promises had been false, and that doctors had been complicit in creating a new addiction epidemic by too readily accepting those promises. But by the time medical opinion was turning against heroin, vast damage had already been done. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people worldwide had been prescribed heroin and had become addicted. Some were morphine addicts who had substituted heroin, now dependent on a different but equally addictive drug. Others were people who had never used opioids before their doctors prescribed heroin for cough or pain. The drug had spread beyond medical channels as well. By the early 1900s, street use of heroin was beginning to appear in major cities. People who had become addicted through medical use but could no longer obtain prescriptions turned to illegal sources. Others discovered heroin through social contacts and began using it recreationally, attracted by the intense euphoria it produced when injected. The New York City Health Department, in a survey conducted in 1915, estimated that the city had over 200,000 narcotic addicts, with heroin overtaking morphine as the preferred drug. This represented a staggering percentage of the city's population, suggesting that opioid addiction was reaching epidemic proportions in urban America. Bayer's response to the growing evidence against heroin was slow and inadequate. For years, the company continued to defend the drug, insisting that problems were due to misuse rather than inherent properties of the substance. They revised their marketing materials to include warnings about the potential for dependence, but these warnings were mild and were overwhelmed by continued emphasis on heroin's therapeutic benefits. The company was caught between medical reality and commercial interests. Heroin had become one of Bayer's most profitable products, generating substantial revenue. acknowledging that the drug was dangerously addictive, would damage sales, invite lawsuits, and destroy the company's reputation. So Bayer equivocated, neither fully defending heroin as they had initially, nor fully accepting responsibility for the addiction crisis their product had created. This corporate response to evidence of serious drug risks, prioritizing profits over patient safety, established patterns that would be repeated by pharmaceutical companies many times throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, up to and including the opioid crisis of our own time. In 1913, facing overwhelming evidence and increasing pressure from medical authorities and government regulators, Bayer finally stopped production of heroin. The company quietly ceased manufacturing the drug that had once been promoted as a wonder medicine, and that had generated enormous profits for over a decade. But stopping production did not solve the problem. By then, heroin had spread worldwide. Other pharmaceutical companies in various countries had begun manufacturing it, either under license from Bayer or after Bayer's patents expired. Chemical synthesis of heroin was relatively simple for anyone with basic pharmaceutical chemistry knowledge and equipment. The process that Alder Wright had described back in 1874 could be performed in any reasonably equipped laboratory. As legal pharmaceutical heroin became harder to obtain, illegal manufacture began to fill the demand from the growing population of addicted users. Clandestine laboratories appeared, first in Europe and later in the United States, producing heroin for the black market. These illegal manufacturers had no quality control, no medical oversight, no concern for purity or safety. Their product varied wildly in strength and often contained dangerous contaminants. Users injecting illicit heroin faced risks not just from the drug itself but from impurities and from uncertain potency that made overdose common. The story of heroin's introduction and early years provides a case study in how pharmaceutical development can go catastrophically wrong when commercial interests override careful science and when the medical profession accepts industry claims too uncritically. Bayer's researchers had conducted what they believed was adequate testing, but they had not studied long-term use, had not properly assessed addiction potential, had not waited long enough to see tolerance and dependence develop in their test subjects. The company had rushed heroin to market, eager to capitalize on what they saw as a breakthrough. They had marketed it aggressively with claims that were not supported by solid evidence and that would prove to be dangerously false. The medical profession had accepted these claims largely on faith, prescribing the drug widely without demanding better evidence of safety. Patients had trusted their doctors and had paid the price, becoming addicted to a drug that was supposed to help them. Government regulation had been absent or ineffective, unable to prevent a dangerous drug from spreading widely before its risks became apparent. These failures would be repeated again and again throughout the 20th century as other drugs were introduced, promoted, widely adopted, and only later recognized as dangerous. The recognition that heroin was dangerously addictive, that it had created a new epidemic of opioid dependence rather than solving the morphine crisis as promised, coincided with a broader shift in attitudes toward drugs and addiction in the early 20th century. The progressive era in the United States, roughly spanning from the 1890s to the 1920s, was a time of intense social reform movements aimed at addressing the problems created by rapid industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. Reformers believed that individual behavior should be regulated for the collective good, that government had a responsibility to protect citizens from vice and moral corruption, and that scientific expertise should be applied to solving social problems. This reform impulse expressed itself in many ways: campaigns for women's suffrage, child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, food and drug safety standards, and prohibition of alcohol. Drug use, particularly the addiction epidemics associated with morphine and heroin, became a major focus of reform efforts. Addiction was increasingly seen not just as an individual medical problem, but as a social disease that threatened the nation's moral and physical health, that created crime and poverty, that destroyed families and communities. The solution, reformers argued, was strict government control of narcotic drugs, making them available only for legitimate medical purposes under physician supervision, with criminal penalties for non-medical use or distribution. The international dimension of drug control was particularly important because narcotics crossed borders easily, and because the drug trade was inherently international, involving production in one country, manufacture in another, and consumption in a third. The United States took the lead in pushing for international drug control agreements, motivated partly by genuine public health concerns, but also by racial anxieties and geopolitical considerations. American colonial administrators in the Philippines, acquired from Spain in 1898, faced the problem of widespread opium use among the Chinese population there. The Americans, influenced by racial prejudices and by Protestant missionary opposition to opium, wanted to prohibit the drug. But this brought them into conflict with other colonial powers in Asia, particularly Britain, which still derived substantial revenue from opium production in India and had forced opium on China through the Opium Wars of the previous century. The United States convened the Shanghai Opium Commission in 1909, bringing together representatives from 13 nations with interests in Asia to discuss opium control. This was the first international drug control conference, setting precedents that would shape international drug policy for the next century. The Commission had no power to enforce decisions but reached general agreement that opium use for non-medical purposes should be gradually suppressed. The Shanghai Commission was followed by the International Opium Convention at The Hague in 1912, which created the first binding international drug control treaty. The Hague Convention required signatory nations to enact domestic laws controlling production, distribution, and use of opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine. Nations were obligated to limit manufacture and trade of these drugs to medical and scientific purposes, to establish licensing systems for pharmaceutical manufacturers and distributors, and to cooperate in suppressing illicit trafficking. The United States, having pushed hard for the convention, now needed to implement it domestically. This led directly to the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, the first comprehensive federal drug control law in American history. The Harrison Act was technically a tax law rather than a prohibition statute, requiring anyone who imported, manufactured, sold, or distributed opium or coca products to register with the federal government, pay taxes, keep detailed records, and dispense these substances only by prescription for legitimate medical purposes. The language was deliberately vague, particularly the crucial phrase legitimate medical purposes, giving federal authorities wide discretionary power in enforcement. This vagueness would have profound consequences for how the law was interpreted and enforced. The key controversy centered on whether prescribing opioids to maintain an addict's habit constituted legitimate medical practice. Addiction medicine at the time involved two main approaches. Some physicians practiced gradual dose reduction, slowly tapering addicted patients off drugs over weeks or months to minimize withdrawal suffering. Others practiced maintenance prescribing, providing stable addicts with regular prescriptions to prevent withdrawal and allow them to function in society, essentially acknowledging that addiction was often chronic and incurable but manageable. Federal authorities, led by the Treasury Department's Bureau of Internal Revenue, which was initially responsible for enforcing the Harrison Act, took a hard line. They decided that maintenance prescribing was not legitimate medical practice, that addiction itself was not a disease requiring treatment with drugs but rather a vice requiring punishment. Physicians who prescribed opioids to maintain addicts, even long-time patients whom the doctors knew would suffer terribly without medication, found themselves arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. In the 5 years following the Harrison Act's passage, over 25,000 physicians were arrested for drug law violations. Of these, about 3,000 lost their licenses and many were imprisoned. The American Medical Association, initially supportive of physicians' right to treat addicted patients as they saw fit, was intimidated into accepting the federal interpretation. By the 1920s, most doctors were terrified to prescribe opioids to anyone who might be addicted, even patients with legitimate pain and documented addiction who clearly needed medical management of their dependence. The immediate consequence of the Harrison Act and its enforcement was catastrophic for America's addict population. Suddenly, people who had been obtaining opioids legally, either through prescriptions or over-the-counter preparations, found their supply cut off. Patent medicines were reformulated to remove or drastically reduce narcotic content. Pharmacies stopped stocking opiate products except those requiring prescriptions. Doctors refused to prescribe for fear of prosecution. Hundreds of thousands of Americans, most of them law-abiding citizens who had become dependent through medical use or through patent medicines, were forced into sudden withdrawal. Many succeeded in stopping, enduring weeks or months of suffering but eventually freeing themselves from dependence. But many others could not endure withdrawal or quickly relapsed after initially stopping. For these people, the only option was to obtain drugs illegally. This created, virtually overnight, a massive black market for opioids in the United States. Criminal organizations that had previously dealt in other illicit goods quickly recognized the profit potential. Opioid prices on the black market were many times higher than legal pharmaceutical prices had been. Quality was unreliable, with street drugs often adulterated or of unknown strength, making overdose common. The Harrison Act, intended to solve America's addiction problem through strict control, instead transformed addiction from a medical problem into a criminal justice problem, and created the basic structure of illegal drug markets that persists to this day. The criminalization of addiction also fundamentally changed the demographics and nature of opioid use in America. Before the Harrison Act, the typical opioid addict was a middle-aged, middle-class white woman who had become dependent through medical treatment or patent medicine use and who maintained her habit through legal channels. After criminalization and the creation of black markets, opioid addiction became increasingly concentrated in marginalized populations, the poor, racial minorities, people involved in other criminal activities. Middle-class users facing the stigma and legal risks of buying from illegal sources were more likely to endure withdrawal and stop using. Those with fewer resources and social supports, living in communities where black markets were more accessible and where police surveillance was heavier, were more likely to continue using despite criminalization. The association of heroin use with crime, poverty, and racial minorities that developed in the 1920s and would persist throughout the 20th century was not inherent to the drug but was created by prohibition policies that forced users into illegal markets and that subjected them to criminal penalties. This association would have lasting effects on public policy and on cultural attitudes toward addiction, making it much harder to adopt public health approaches to what was fundamentally a medical problem. Heroin itself, despite Bayer's cessation of production and despite increasing legal restrictions, did not disappear. On the contrary, it became the dominant opioid in illegal markets, largely replacing morphine and opium. There were several reasons for this. First, heroin was more potent than morphine by weight, meaning that a given quantity of heroin represented more doses and more profit for smugglers and dealers. Second, heroin was more compact, making it easier to conceal and transport. Third, heroin was easier to inject than morphine for users without medical training, dissolving rapidly in water without requiring heat or special preparation. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, heroin produced more intense euphoria when injected intravenously, especially the initial rush, making it more attractive to recreational users seeking intense intoxication rather than just pain relief or withdrawal prevention. The illegal heroin trade that developed in the 1920s and expanded dramatically in subsequent decades had its origins in several source regions. Turkey and Persia, now Iran, had long traditions of opium poppy cultivation and were major suppliers of raw opium. This opium could be processed into morphine base using relatively simple chemistry, reducing bulk for shipping. The morphine base would then be transported to secondary processing sites, particularly in France, where it would be converted to heroin in clandestine laboratories. The French Connection, as this network became known, dominated the global heroin trade for decades. Marseille, France's great Mediterranean port city, became the center of heroin manufacturing and distribution to Western markets. The city had several advantages for drug trafficking. Its busy port, handling cargo from around the world, made it easy to smuggle raw materials and finished products. Its history as a center of organized crime, particularly the Corsican mob, provided the criminal infrastructure necessary for large-scale illegal operations. France's sophisticated chemical and pharmaceutical industries, legacies of the country's leadership in 19th-century chemistry, meant that people with the skills and equipment to manufacture heroin were relatively common. The French government's relatively weak enforcement against drug trafficking, at least compared to the United States, meant that illegal laboratories could operate with less risk. Raw opium or morphine base from Turkey and elsewhere would arrive in Marseille by ship, often hidden in legitimate cargo, or smuggled in small quantities by individual couriers. Chemists working for criminal organizations, often people with legitimate pharmaceutical training who had been recruited or coerced, would convert the morphine base to heroin in hidden laboratories. The heroin would then be packaged and smuggled to consumer markets, particularly the United States, using various routes and methods. Some was smuggled by ship, hidden in cargo containers or in secret compartments on vessels. Some was carried by individual couriers, people who swallowed packets of heroin wrapped in latex or other materials, or who concealed them in body cavities or specially modified luggage. Some was mixed with legitimate shipments of goods, to be separated out after customs inspection. The French Connection operated with remarkable efficiency and scale from the 1930s through the early 1970s, supplying the majority of heroin consumed in the United States during this period, and generating billions of dollars in profits for organized crime. The period from the 1920s through the 1960s saw heroin use in the United States follow a pattern that would become familiar from later drug epidemics. An initial wave of users, many of them people who had become addicted during the era when heroin was legally prescribed, aged, and their numbers declined through death and through some achieving abstinence. A second wave emerged in the 1940s and 1950s, concentrated in poor urban neighborhoods, particularly in New York City, Chicago, Detroit, and other major cities. This wave was associated with jazz musicians and the bohemian subculture, giving heroin a certain countercultural cachet. Jazz legends like Charlie Parker and Billie Holiday struggled with heroin addiction, and their experiences, romanticized by some, warned by others, became part of the drug's mythology. The third wave, beginning in the 1960s, was larger and more diverse. Heroin use spread beyond the urban poor and the jazz scene to affect middle-class young people, particularly those involved in the counterculture and anti-war movements. The Vietnam War created yet another generation of addicted servicemen, as heroin was widely available in Southeast Asia, and many soldiers used it to cope with the trauma and boredom of war. When these veterans returned home, many continued using, bringing their addiction back with them. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, partly on a law and order platform that emphasized combating drug use and crime, declared a war on drugs in 1971. This represented a major escalation in American drug policy, transforming what had been primarily a law enforcement issue into a militarized campaign with international dimensions. Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973, consolidating various federal drug agencies into a single organization with broad powers and substantial funding. The DEA was tasked with enforcing drug laws domestically and with operating internationally, working with foreign governments to disrupt drug production and trafficking at the source. American drug enforcement agents were stationed in countries around the world, pressuring foreign governments to crack down on drug cultivation and processing, providing training and equipment, conducting joint operations. This represented an unprecedented extension of American law enforcement power beyond its borders. The war on drugs also meant dramatically increased criminal penalties for drug offenses. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced, requiring judges to impose specific prison terms for drug crimes regardless of individual circumstances. These sentences grew increasingly harsh over the following decades, with some drug offenders receiving life imprisonment for non-violent offenses. The war on drugs achieved some tactical successes, particularly the eventual breakup of the French Connection in the early 1970s. Coordinated operations by American, French, and Turkish law enforcement succeeded in dismantling the major laboratories in Marseille and disrupting the Turkish opium supply. Dozens of major traffickers were arrested and imprisoned. Heroin seizures increased dramatically, but these enforcement successes did not reduce drug use or end the heroin trade. Instead, they illustrated what would become known as the balloon effect. When drug production or trafficking is suppressed in one location, it simply moves to another. With the French Connection disrupted, heroin production shifted to other regions. The Golden Triangle, the mountainous area where Burma, Thailand, and Laos meet, had been a secondary source of heroin, serving primarily Asian markets. In the 1970s and 1980s, production there expanded dramatically to supply Western markets. Various warlords and ethnic insurgent armies in Burma, fighting against the central government and controlling large territories, financed their operations through opium cultivation and heroin manufacture. The most notorious was Kun Se, who at his peak controlled approximately 70% of the world's heroin supply through his private army and extensive laboratory network. Mexico, which had never been a major opium producer, began cultivating poppies in remote mountainous regions where climate and terrain were suitable and where government control was weak. Mexican heroin, while generally considered lower quality than Asian product, had the advantage of being much closer to the United States market and easier to smuggle across the long, porous border. Mexican production increased steadily through the late 20th century, eventually making Mexico a major source of heroin consumed in the United States. Afghanistan, which would later become the world's dominant opium producer, was initially a minor player. The country had traditional opium cultivation in some regions, but production was relatively small. This changed dramatically with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the subsequent decade-long war. Mujahideen resistance fighters, armed and funded by the United States, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to fight the Soviets, needed revenue for their operations. Opium provided that revenue. Mujahideen commanders taxed poppy farmers, operated their own cultivation, and facilitated transport of opium to processing laboratories in Pakistan. The CIA, focused on defeating the Soviets, turned a blind eye to this trade, prioritizing the anti-Soviet struggle over drug control. By the end of the Soviet occupation in 1989, Afghanistan had become a major opium producer, a position it would maintain and expand in subsequent decades. The pattern that had emerged by the late 20th century was clear and troubling. Despite enormous expenditures on enforcement, despite international cooperation and sophisticated interdiction efforts, despite harsh criminal penalties for trafficking and use, the illegal heroin trade persisted and even expanded. Every time one source was disrupted, another emerged. Every time one trafficking route was closed, another opened. The fundamental economics of the drug trade made it virtually impossible to suppress through enforcement alone. Heroin is extraordinarily valuable relative to its weight, many times more valuable than gold. A kilogram of pure heroin, easily concealed and transported, might be worth tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars at wholesale prices, and several million at street prices after cutting and distribution. These profit margins meant that traffickers could afford to lose shipments to seizure, could pay substantial bribes, could absorb enforcement costs, and still make enormous profits. The profits also ensured that there would always be people willing to take the risks of involvement in the trade, because for poor farmers in Afghanistan, or Burma or Mexico, opium cultivation might be the only way to earn a living wage, and for urban poor in source and transit countries, working for trafficking organizations might be the best economic opportunity available. Enforcement efforts also had unintended negative consequences that often made drug problems worse rather than better. The balloon effect, where suppressing production in one region caused it to move to another, meant that enforcement was playing a perpetual game of whack-a-mole, achieving temporary local successes, but failing to reduce global supply. The escalation effect meant that enforcement pressure incentivized traffickers to develop more efficient, more potent, more easily concealed forms of drugs. This explained the shift from opium to morphine to heroin as prohibition intensified, each stage representing a more concentrated, more dangerous form, but also more profitable and easier to smuggle. The corruption effect meant that the enormous profits in drug trafficking created powerful incentives for corruption of law enforcement, military, and government officials. In many source and transit countries, drug trafficking organizations effectively controlled or at least heavily influenced government institutions through a combination of bribes and threats. The violence effect meant that prohibition pushed drug markets into a criminal realm where disputes could not be resolved through legal mechanisms, and where violence became the primary means of enforcing agreements, protecting territory, and intimidating rivals. Drug trafficking violence killed tens of thousands annually in countries like Mexico and Colombia, and contributed to urban violence in consumer countries. Perhaps most significantly, prohibition created a criminal justice crisis in the United States that devastated communities and overwhelmed the legal system without solving the drug problem. The dramatic escalation of drug war enforcement from the 1970s onward led to an explosion in incarceration rates. In 1970, approximately 300,000 people were incarcerated in the United States, in federal and state prisons and local jails combined. By 2000, that number had grown to over 2 million, a nearly seven-fold increase. The United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, held approximately 25% of the world's prisoners. Drug offenses accounted for a large percentage of this increase. Many of those imprisoned for drug crimes were not major traffickers but low-level dealers or users. The racial disparities were stark and troubling. Despite evidence that drug use rates were similar across racial groups, African Americans and Latinos were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for drug offenses at far higher rates than whites. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which devastated many black urban communities, was met with ferocious law enforcement response and harsh mandatory sentences. Laws established drastically different sentences for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, despite the substances being pharmacologically nearly identical, with the sentencing disparity clearly targeting the form used primarily in black communities. The result was that by the 1990s, 1 in 3 black men could expect to be imprisoned at some point in their lives, compared to 1 in 17 white men, with drug offenses a major driver of this disparity. This mass incarceration destroyed families and communities, creating cycles of disadvantage that persisted across generations. Children grew up with incarcerated parents. Men and women emerged from prison with criminal records that made employment difficult or impossible, ensuring poverty and often leading to reoffending. Communities were stripped of working-age adults, particularly men, disrupting social structures and economic activity. The financial cost was also staggering, with states spending tens of billions annually on incarceration, money that might have been spent on education, healthcare, drug treatment, or economic development. Yet despite this enormous human and financial cost, drug use rates did not decline significantly. Drug availability remained high. Drug prices remained relatively stable or even decreased, suggesting that supply was not being effectively restricted. The war on drugs, judged by its stated objectives of reducing drug use and availability, was a failure. Judged by its actual effects on communities and individuals, particularly in communities of color, it was a catastrophe. By the early 21st century, there was growing recognition that the war on drugs had failed and that new approaches were needed. Some jurisdictions began implementing harm reduction strategies, needle exchange programs to prevent disease transmission among injection drug users, supervised injection sites where users could consume drugs under medical supervision with immediate help available if they overdosed, and widespread distribution of naloxone, an opioid antagonist that could reverse overdoses if administered quickly. These harm reduction approaches were controversial, with critics arguing that they enabled drug use rather than discouraging it, but evidence from jurisdictions that implemented them showed that they saved lives without increasing drug use rates. There was also growing acceptance of medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction, using drugs like methadone and buprenorphine that satisfied opioid dependence without producing euphoria, allowing addicts to stabilize their lives while gradually reducing dependence. This represented a return to the maintenance approach that had been common before the Harrison Act, an implicit acknowledgement that criminalization had failed and that addiction was better addressed as a medical problem. Some countries went further, experimenting with outright decriminalization of drug possession. Portugal, which implemented drug decriminalization in 2001, treating possession of small amounts for personal use as an administrative offense rather than a crime, saw dramatic improvements in public health outcomes without increases in drug use. These examples suggested that there were alternatives to the criminal justice approach, alternatives that might be more effective and more humane, though they remained politically difficult to implement in the United States, where tough-on-crime rhetoric and the war on drugs mentality remained deeply entrenched in politics and public opinion. As the 20th century drew to a close, heroin remained a significant problem, with an estimated 1 million or more dependent users in the United States and millions more worldwide, but it was no longer the dominant opioid crisis. Prescription opioids, particularly new formulations developed by pharmaceutical companies and marketed aggressively to physicians, were creating a new epidemic that would eventually dwarf heroin's impact, and would demonstrate that the pharmaceutical industry had learned nothing from the heroin disaster of a century earlier. The stage was being set for a crisis that would be remarkably similar to what had happened with heroin, a crisis driven by pharmaceutical company deception, medical profession credulity, inadequate regulation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of addiction. The opioid epidemic that would emerge in the 1990s and accelerate through the early 21st century would follow a tragically familiar pattern, proving that those who do not learn from history are indeed condemned to repeat it. And ultimately this new crisis would circle back to heroin in unexpected ways, as prescription opioid users, unable to obtain legal supply, would turn to illegal markets where heroin, and eventually the even more dangerous synthetic opioid fentanyl, awaited them. The story of heroin, which began with Bayer's promise of a miracle cure, would continue into the 21st century with consequences that the chemists who first synthesized it could never have imagined. And so we arrive at the present, at the bitter conclusion of a story that began with hope and ended in devastation that continues to this day. The history of heroin is not just a history of a drug, It is a history of human hubris, of the dangerous belief that we can outsmart nature and chemistry, that we can isolate the benefits of powerful substances while eliminating their risks. It is a history of corporate greed, of pharmaceutical companies prioritizing profits over patient safety, making grandiose claims based on inadequate evidence, and then denying responsibility when the consequences become undeniable. It is a history of medical profession failure, of doctors too willing to accept industry claims without demanding rigorous proof, too quick to prescribe powerful drugs without fully understanding their effects, too slow to acknowledge when they have contributed to harm. It is a history of policy failure, of governments that responded to addiction with punishment rather than treatment, that created criminal markets through prohibition while failing to provide adequate healthcare for those suffering from dependence. Most fundamentally, it is a history of human vulnerability, of our desperate desire to escape pain and suffering, and of how that vulnerability has been exploited again and again by those who should have protected us. The tragedy of heroin is that the pattern has repeated itself. In the 1990s, as heroin use remained steady but was largely confined to marginalized populations, the pharmaceutical industry launched a new campaign to expand opioid prescribing, claiming that pain was being systematically undertreated and that new formulations of opioids were safe for chronic pain management. Companies like Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed drugs like OxyContin, assuring doctors that addiction risk was minimal when used as prescribed, that concerns about opioid dependence were outdated and exaggerated. This was almost exactly what Bayer had claimed about heroin a century earlier, and it was just as false. The result was an explosion in opioid prescribing that created the worst drug crisis in American history, with hundreds of thousands dead and millions addicted. And when prescription supplies were eventually restricted as the crisis became undeniable, many of those addicted to prescription opioids turned to heroin, which was cheaper and more available on the black market. The heroin epidemic that emerged in the 2010s was directly connected to the prescription opioid epidemic, completing a circle that connected Bayer's deception in 1898 to Purdue Pharma's deception in the 1990s. Then came fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin, which began flooding into illegal drug markets in the mid-2010s. Drug dealers, seeking to maximize profits, started adulterating heroin with fentanyl, or replacing it entirely while still selling it as heroin. Users, unable to distinguish between the substances and often unaware they were consuming fentanyl, began overdosing in unprecedented numbers. A dose of heroin that a tolerant user could handle safely might be fatal if it contained fentanyl. Overdose deaths skyrocketed from approximately 20,000 in 1999 to over 100,000 annually by 2021. With synthetic opioids like fentanyl accounting for the vast majority. This is more than die from car accidents, more than from gun violence, more than from HIV/AIDS at its peak. Behind every statistic is a human being, someone's child or parent or spouse or friend, someone who struggled with pain and sought relief, who became trapped by addiction, who died a preventable death. The scale of loss is almost incomprehensible, a death toll equivalent to a major war. Yet it unfolds quietly, one overdose at a time, in homes and homeless encampments and public bathrooms across the nation. Looking back over more than a century of heroin's history, certain lessons emerge with painful clarity. First, there is no safe way to make opioids non-addictive while preserving their pain-relieving properties. The same neurological mechanisms that create analgesia also create the potential for dependence. Every attempt to create a non-addictive opioid has failed. From heroin to OxyContin, and future attempts will likely fail as well. We must prescribe opioids with appropriate caution, using them when necessary, but never casually, always with awareness of addiction risk. Second, pharmaceutical companies cannot be trusted to honestly assess and report the risks of their products. The profit motive is too powerful. Companies will minimize risks, exaggerate benefits, and continue selling dangerous products until forced to stop by regulators or lawsuits. We need strong independent regulation with the power to demand rigorous safety testing, and to remove dangerous drugs from the market quickly. Third, prohibition does not work to eliminate drug use and consistently produces consequences worse than the problems it attempts to solve. The war on drugs has failed by every measure, creating massive incarceration, empowering criminal organizations, generating violence, while failing to significantly reduce drug use or availability. We need new approaches based on public health rather than criminal justice. treating addiction as a medical condition requiring treatment rather than a crime requiring punishment. Fourth, harm reduction works. Programs like needle exchanges, supervised injection sites, naloxone distribution, and medication-assisted treatment save lives without increasing drug use. These should be widely available, destigmatized, and adequately funded. Fifth, we must address the underlying conditions that make people vulnerable to addiction: poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity, chronic pain, mental illness, social isolation. As long as these conditions persist, people will seek escape through drugs, and prohibition will simply determine whether they obtain those drugs through legal or illegal channels. Finally, we must extend compassion to those suffering from addiction, recognizing that they are not moral failures, but people with a medical condition, that most became addicted through circumstances beyond their full control, and that recovery is possible but requires support rather than condemnation. The story of heroin, which began in 1898 with a pharmaceutical company's promise of a miracle cure, continues today in the ongoing opioid crisis that claims over 100,000 American lives annually. Bayer's chemists could not have imagined that the drug they created would spread across the world, that it would enslave millions, that it would contribute to immeasurable suffering across generations. They believed they were advancing medical science, improving on nature, helping humanity, but good intentions are not enough when dealing with substances this powerful. The road to the opioid epidemic was paved with good intentions, with promises of miracle cures, with assurances that this time would be different. We have learned, at terrible cost, that such promises are almost certainly false, that nature cannot be so easily fooled, and that powerful drugs always carry risks that must be respected. The question now is whether we will finally learn from this history, or whether we are condemned to repeat it yet again with the next generation of drugs. The lives of millions depend on getting the answer right.